Unfortunately, after one active shooter exercise, I overheard the firefighters talking to their battalion chief saying, "Hey, chief, that was all fun and all that, but you don't expect us to do this in real life, do you?"
Enchanted Sky Media.
This is Code 3, the Firefighters podcast. Now, here's your host, Scott Orr.
That's right, and I will not let Parkinson stop me. Thank you for joining me again here on Code 3. This is the show for and about firefighters. We're informing and entertaining members of the fire service, just like you, from coast to coast. You know, active shooter situations seem to be happening more and more frequently. For fire departments, that means a need to develop a good working relationship with police and maybe a closer one with other EMS agencies. That could be as simple as a common set of definitions for words used on the scene. You know, plain talk. Today's guest, Jim Morrissey, is here to explain. Jim is a former tactical paramedic for the San Francisco FBI SWAT team. He's the founder of the Tactical Medical Association of California. He's the Terrorism Preparedness Coordinator for Alameda County EMS, and he's a medical intelligence officer for the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. Jim has lectured in over 25 countries on emergency medicine, wilderness rescue, and tactical medical operations, and he's co-written a couple of books. More on that a little later. Jim Morrissey joins me now to talk about interagency cooperation and exactly what that means in the real world. Welcome to Code 3, Jim.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Scott.
How do agencies currently interact at these kinds of scenes?
Optimistically, there is this encouraging trend around the country for all first responder public safety disciplines, EMS, fire, and law enforcement, to work together. There are federal agencies, of course, FEMA, Department of Homeland Security, and whatnot, as well as the International Association of Fire Chiefs and the fire unions have all written and published white papers, if you will, on supporting the notion of better integration of the response disciplines, a more aggressive posture for EMS and fire, and changing the paradigm, much like Columbine changed the paradigm for law enforcement, not waiting for SWAT, getting in there, first officer on scene, enter into an active shooter situation to mitigate the threat. It's taken fire and EMS quite a while, a number of years, to realize their paradigm has to shift as well. And, actually one of the articles I wrote was called Redefining Clear. Historically, fire and EMS were waiting for the absolute all clear, which really meant every barrel, basement, cabinet, bathroom, attic, closet, desk was cleared by law enforcement, taking minutes, if not hours, before they would enter into a scene. Now the shift is law enforcement eliminates the threat, and in this area, if you will, let's say the cafeteria, no bad guys, no bombs. It's clear enough. We don't know where the bad guy is, but he's not here, or maybe he's dead, which happens quite often. And we need to get these emergency response disciplines in there to actively save lives. We have this mantra that we use now, which I think is simple and appropriate. The first priority is stop the killing, and then the second priority is stop the dying. And that's everybody's responsibility, not just EMS and fire, but law enforcement has shifted gears and initiating casualty care on scene. So anyway, the trend is encouraging. Lots of disciplines and jurisdictions across the country have embraced this new paradigm and are training and shifting their priorities and policies. So, not everybody's on board yet, but it's just a matter of time.
On the whole, how would you assess how fire and EMS are working with law enforcement in these situations?
Well, I think, as I said, there are encouraging developments. I mean, just right now, this summer alone, I'm involved with 4 or 5 different jurisdictions in the Bay Area that are all embarking on creating active shooter exercises, embracing the concept that it's multidiscipline coordination in the planning phase. And so I would say we're doing well. We need to do better. The training, for example, one of the ways we're doing an exercise is for law enforcement to do some training on their own in the morning, basically eliminate the threat, room clears, use of force policy, all that. While at the same time, fire and EMS are getting training on just-in-time training, medical care, point of wounding care, triage priorities, embracing tourniquet application, chest seals, wound packing, that sort of thing. And then later in the morning, they actually get together and do some walkthroughs on rescue task force maneuvers, discuss terminology, as you mentioned earlier, about the difference between cover and concealment and emergency evacuation, rally point, casualty collection points, and then do some slow walkthroughs, and understand the difference between, a sort of a diamond formation escort and then shifting gears. If an area, let's say the library is where all the casualties are, if law enforcement can lock that area down, we now have a beachhead. And if they can staff a safe corridor out to the casualty collection point, then you really don't need that escort anymore, and you can sort of, operate freely inside that secured zone. So those are great activities to do as a walkthrough. And then in the afternoon, shift gears and do some exercises. I'm publishing a series of articles in EMS1.com and Police1.com on how do you actually plan and execute an active shooter type training. And by the way, it doesn't have to be just active shooter. It's the same thing for a bombing, an IED, even a naturally occurring disasters. These multidiscipline exercises are happening more and more frequently, which is critical to the success that we need to effectively save some lives out there.
What reaction or what general mindset do you see from fire and EMS as concerns this whole thing? I mean, we have some agencies now that have gone to body armor and they're protecting themselves. But from your point of view, what do you see in terms of attitudinal changes?
That's a great question, and it really varies. I mean, unfortunately, after one active shooter exercise in a relatively local jurisdiction, I overheard the firefighters talking to their battalion chief saying, "Hey, chief, that was all fun and all that, but you don't expect us to do this in real life, do you?" And I was just floored that, their response was very sort of a very historical perspective of, we're not going in there, we're not going into a war zone. We don't, these guys didn't have ballistic protection. And, and I'm thinking, wow, you'll go into an upside down car in the middle of a highway in a rainstorm, to extricate people. But, statistically, these active shooter situations are done in 5 minutes. There's one shooter, statistically speaking. The FBI did a extensive study looking at 160 active shooter incidents, and all but 2 of them were perpetrated by a single person. So one person, over in 5 minutes. Either they flee, they kill themselves, or they are engaged with law enforcement. So we have to use data and statistics to, really shape our policies and procedures. And, with a law enforcement escort and protection, I would argue you're far more safer responding to an active shooter incident than any domestic violence scene you run into. So that scenario I gave is the exception. By and large, the firefighter community, EMS community are embracing this change. They want policies, they want procedures, they want to make sure that there's training, there's properly equipment, there's ballistic protection, and training and exercise opportunities to then create an environment to create, solid policies and procedures. So it does vary, but I would say on the whole, that the response community has embraced this new approach to responding to these kinds of incidents.
I'll be back with more right after this.
Every day, you put your life on the line to protect our families, friends, communities, cities, and our nation. Federal Resources knows the dangers you encounter daily. Whether it's fire, hazmat, or the more recent opioid threats, we're here to support you, protect you, and help train you for your next mission. You're looking out for everyone else. Let us look out for you. federalresources.com.
It sounds as though the major challenges then would consist of attitude adjustment and getting everybody on board. Is that fair?
It is fair, and I think, I one of the articles I wrote in EMS 1 was on active shooter training mistakes. So just because you participate in an active shooter event, and I'm recalling a training a number of years ago where the law enforcement had asked a number of engine companies to participate in this exercise, which they did, but the engine companies were basically standing around for about 2 hours before they got engaged, and then the engagement was basically, going into some inflatable mannequins with triage tags attached to them. So the training value was not great, and it was really, in their mind, kind of, quote, a waste of time, which I can understand. And so that's why the exercise, whoever hosts it, you need to have those disciplines participate in the planning so that there's something for everybody. There's very little downtime, and it needs to be, really coordinated and embraced, and sort of the exercise has to be owned by representatives from law enforcement, from fire, from EMS, and certainly the whatever facility you're using. If you're using a school, you need the school resource officer. If you're using, the transit agency, you need them on board. If certainly the airport, whatever it happens to be, a hospital, you need to have those hosting agencies involved as well. And then another important thing is for the law enforcement, of course, it's eliminate the threat and then protect EMS. For EMS and fire, what they really need to have to make it palatable and captivating is good role players, some degree of moulage, some degree of accurate portrayal of the injury patterns that they might see. They need to have training equipment that they can actually bust open. They can put on a tourniquet. They can open a chest seal and apply it to an open chest injury. They can pack a wound. They extricate to a CCP. Then I think they feel like, oh, that was worth it. So as the training and the planning will drive the attitude towards participating in these events and then embracing it as a real life response.
Now, that's training. How much real life experience have we had with seeing fire and EMS going into a hot zone or a warm zone?
Well, I think, the terminology is important. In a hot zone, we really don't want fire and EMS in that area. That's really reserved for a tactical medic, a medic that is either law enforcement or attached to a law enforcement team that has been significantly trained in dealing with those kinds of situation and operate as basically an operator on a tactical team.
That individual would be armed, I would assume.
No, not necessarily. If they are with our FBI, for our medics there, civilian medics are not armed. We do wear ballistic protection, but we're escorted by SWAT operators or non-SWAT FBI agents that are assigned to us to look out for us, to protect us, and to escort us. But even in that situation, we are not going to go into a zone where quote unquote the bullets are flying. And so there are some tactical medics who are law enforcement, who are armed, and who very well may be in the high threat zone and may be actively engaged in a gunfight per se. But that's really limited to law enforcement tactical operators who are also acting in a role as a medic.
All right, then, in terms of fire and EMS that has gone into a scene, have you been involved with a situation where that's happened, or have you seen an after-action report or a debriefing on something like that, and how did it go?
Yes, and I certainly am also an expert witness that reviews these cases and procedures, and we've certainly had our share of these around the Bay Area. a relatively recent one where some personnel that I was familiar with, the Oiko shooting of a college, and a disgruntled student basically executed a number of fellow students and injured a number, and then fled the scene. So Oakland police locked the scene down. They searched for the perpetrator. The perpetrator got in a car and left. So they didn't know where the bad guy or the shooter was, but they did know that he wasn't where the injured people were. So they created what we call a beachhead. Basically, they protected that area, and then they created a safe corridor through the actual corridors out to where EMS and fire were, and then they escorted in the medics to then triage and try to salvage the injuries or the injured people as best as possible, and then extricate them out and transport them to a trauma center. So, we certainly have seen that in real life, and I think the shift has been a positive one, in that law enforcement realizes that their job is just not only to eliminate the threat, but it's to make arrangements for either the casualties out or medics in. And in addition to that, we're seeing a tremendous trend of law enforcement, beginning that initial casualty care on scene. And, many officers are carrying some degree of life-saving equipment on there for self-care, buddy care, and they are focusing using that equipment on the injured casualties as a result of some horrific event.
Now that brings up an interesting point. Are law enforcement, or I should say, how are law enforcement officers responding to this idea that they have to protect the medics, or that they may have to care for victims themselves? How is that going over?
I think the understanding is pretty universal across the country, but not 100%. And there are still law enforcement officers that are extremely reticent to initiate any casualty care. There are a few that feel like their job is security only. But as one well-respected ex-military, Thomas DiTommaso, who was actually in Black Hawk Down, who does a lot of training, he said it makes no sense at all to have 8 guns pointing down a corridor when you have bleeding kids 5 feet away from you. Put 1 gun down the corridor, everybody else start caring for these kids. And so I think cops are realizing that it's not just security, but they have basically an obligation to render aid. And in California anyway, every law enforcement officer goes through a 21-hour medical training as part of their academy. And those that are out now are still going through that training, which includes active shooter response and tactical casualty care. So I think, at least the officers I've dealt with, which has been hundreds, if not thousands. I was in Algeria actually recently training their national counterterrorism team, doing the same kind of thing. They're training to save their lives, their partners' lives, and also civilians, and even the perpetrator themselves. We have one well-known local law enforcement officer who's put on about 8 tourniquets in the last year, and they've all been on perpetrators or gun victims who have been in gunfights with other suspects. And so that part I think is again a great trend. The other part of the responsibility to protect the medics, law enforcement officers responding to a scene, their first mission is the contact team, get in there, find the shooter, eliminate the shooter, sequester or isolate, and distract the shooter. So they're not going to hang around with a rescue task force if there's still an active threat. They're going to go in and have multiple contact teams. But once that threat is mitigated, and then they understand if we're really there to save lives, to do the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people, then they can dispatch a few resources to act as a protective element to the rescue task force, which is in this area, it is both fire-based EMS and also private-based EMS will work together to create a rescue task force.
All right, we'll leave it there. Jim Morrissey, thanks for talking with us today on Code 3.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And we put more information on interagency cooperation and Jim's 2 books on our website at code3podcast.com/cooperation. Check it out. Here comes your trivia question. When did the first fire apparatus arrive in America? I'll have the answer right after this.
Now's your chance to get your hands on Code 3 t-shirts, sweatshirts, and more. Show your support for the podcast that supports firefighters from coast to coast. Just go to code3podcast.com and click on the Code 3 store link. Or go to code3podcast.com/shop and tell the world that you're a Code 3 fan.
Here is your trivia answer. In the 1700s, the first hand pumpers arrived in America from England. They had long parallel handles that required a bunch of volunteers to pump up and down rapidly to move water from the machine's tub into the hoses. But they were still far better than the bucket brigades. American manufacturers copied these designs, they refined them, and used them for almost 100 years. So there you go. All right, that's it. That's all for this edition of Code 3. Thank you for listening. I'll be back next time with more. I'm Scott Orr, and until then, I'll see you later.
Code 3 is a production of Enchanted Sky Media. To get in contact with us, visit code3podcast.com. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you should. Don't miss an episode. Find us at the Apple iTunes Store, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.